Okay, we're back. We left off here, whether we realize it or not, and another one of the early major battles of the war involved an air war, an air battle, completely in the air, known as the Battle of Britain. This was from the German side supposed to be preparation for a cross-channel invasion from occupied France to Great Britain. Hitler did intend to take England by force, the one country that was holding out against him, but he needed to reduce, or believed that he needed to reduce, as did his generals, the RAF, or Royal Air Force, in order to do so. But it wasn't to be in the end, because after several weeks of intense fighting over the skies of England, the RAF more or less defeated the German Luftwaffe, their air force, and for a number of reasons. So this episode, this period, is what Winston Churchill famously referred to as Britain's finest hour. So why did the British win the Battle of Britain? Number one, they had better fighter planes overall, Spitfires and Hurricanes, most importantly, which oddly enough didn't have as much firepower as their German counterparts, weren't as fast, and didn't have as much armor on them, but they had sort of one crucial advantage, which proved to be all that was necessary, and that is the advantage of maneuverability. So with the greater maneuverability of the British planes, they were able to best their German counterparts more often than not, though not conclusively. Another advantage that helps explain the win overall is the British use of radar. Just like in intelligence breaking the German code, the British led the way on the Allied side there. They led the way here in this technology, being able to detect German planes before they got there, which saved Britain, the RAF, the hassle or difficulty of having to spread their planes out across Britain in order to, because they don't know where the attacks are coming. Now, with radar, they knew where they were coming, and they could concentrate their planes in the right place. So they could concentrate at the point of attack, which was a great advantage. The Germans were somewhat slow to realize the importance of bombing radar facilities, radar antenna. Also, another key factor in this is Germany switching from bombing airfields to bombing cities, which is more or less the same as Hitler's change in strategy. There's a little difference, but I'm going to kind of combine them for reasons of time. Hitler, in the middle of the Battle of Britain, actually bombed London rather badly, not for the last time in the war. Tens of thousands of British civilians killed through German bombing in the war by war's end. But Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister by this time, and the leaders, both military and political, not all of whom agreed with him, but a lot of them did, decided to retaliate by sending a bombing raid over Berlin, which infuriated Hitler, and he later claimed that that's not the reason that he changed strategy in the Battle of Britain, but it appears to have been the reason, most likely. And so, because Hitler was incensed, although both sides had bombed each other's capitals, Hitler now started bombing London relentlessly day after day. The reason this proved to be so fateful in a negative way for the Germans and a savior for the British is that they'd been bombing airfields before and been hitting so many planes, knocking them out on the ground, that they were actually gradually reducing the RAF's numbers. They weren't able to put planes back into the field coming off the assembly lines to counteract the losses. So had they kept up the strategy, that probably would have continued. But Hitler switched from airfields to bombing London. He thought that it would catch the British in larger quantities of planes because they would have to concentrate over London to protect the city. But it didn't really work out that way. And without bombing the airfields, the British were able to then produce planes from their factories and replenish those that were lost, and then some. So for not the last time, not even if not the last time in the war, or the first time actually, because the Battle for France was before this, Hitler made decisions for his generals and field marshals, general staff, that ended up being disastrous. Hitler butted into military strategy far too often for Germany's sake, which ended up being great for the other side. Why was all this important? Well, one, it made a German invasion of the UK impossible. There was a few other things that made it impossible too, but that was one of them. It fatally weakened the German Luftwaffe for the rest of the war, primarily, and it made Great Britain a giant invasion staging platform. I know that sounds funny, but that might be the greatest contribution of Britain to the overall victory in World War II of the Allies, and that is that by holding out and defending themselves successfully without Germany taking them, it then allowed the Allies to have control of a giant piece of territory just across from occupied Europe, France, and the home country of Germany, in which they later could and did send millions of troops from different parts of the world, mainly the United States, and thousands of weapons, planes, tanks, ships, and all kinds of supplies, and made this massive sort of warehouse with the capability of going just across the English Channel and invading occupied Europe. So these are the main important consequences of the Battle of Britain. Which brings us to Winston Churchill himself. He's always been controversial. He was in his own lifetime. Some people hated him, some loved him, even some that hated him recognized that he was gifted politically in many ways, certainly had the gift of oratory. I happen to think he was one of Britain's and Europe's greatest leaders, and he was kind of the right person in the right place at the right time. He had a tenacity to him and an optimism, not always in private, but in public, that I think infected the public. He had kind of a bulldog or pit bull tenacity that does appear to have kind of rubbed off on the public and kind of represented what the British were doing overall, which is staunchly defending themselves against the Nazi threat. And it was a serious threat and was taken that way. The British leaders and public alike for a while thought they were going to go under. They thought they were going to be invaded and that they'd lose. They didn't have much of an army left to defend the homeland if Hitler's ships and troops got across the English Channel. And they were so in fear of losing that at one point the government, Churchill's government, sent the crown jewels and Britain's gold reserves to Canada for safekeeping. And they thought they might have to evacuate the government to Canada and carry out, continue the war from afar, making their temporary capital in Canada. So things looked grim, and Brits were in some ways resigned to their fate, but in other ways were incredibly tenacious, as was their leader, tenacious and spirited in his leadership. Some of his most famous speeches came right during this period. I read this partly because I love to. He said in his blood, toil, sweat, and tears and sweat speech in May of 1940, just as the battle for France was underway, we have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I can say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It's victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire, no survival for all that the British Empire stood for, no survival for the urge and impulses of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. But I take up my task with buoyancy and hope. I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time I feel entitled to claim the aid of all, and I say, come then, let us go forward together with our united strength. In June of 1940, around just a month later, around the fall of France, he said in another famous speech, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. In his famous we shall fight on the beaches speech. So Churchill did offer spirited and experienced leadership. He'd held many posts high in government for many, many years. This was his first time as Prime Minister, but he's one of the great war leaders in British and European history, in my view. Some think he's far overrated, but I do not. He has some questionable things on his record, but none of them come during World War II. I think I mentioned before that in the previous unit and the beginning of this one that an invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany was kind of in the Nazi DNA, mainly because of the perceived need for Lebensraum, or living space, most of which existed to the east. The huge, vast, open plains with fertile soil were all to be had in Poland, the Ukraine, Belarus, and so it does appear that an invasion of the Soviet Union, however foolhardy it may have been, was almost destined to happen once Hitler came to power and once his philosophy was put into place. However, it may have been doomed to failure. Timothy Snyder at Yale, in a relatively recent book, said the invasion of the Soviet Union was a fantasy, meaning that there was no chance that it would succeed. Though I know one historian, I have the book, I read it, who makes the case that if things had gone somewhat differently, there's every reason to believe that Hitler and the Nazis, German Wehrmacht, could have actually defeated Russia. But the invasion of the Soviet Union that came on June 22nd, 1941, which ended, of course, the truce between the two countries, saw from that point forward the largest scale fighting on land in human history. There's a lot of elements in this war, events in this war that are the largest. We'll see others here, the largest this or that in human history. Just on this Russian or Eastern Front alone, there are approximately 30 million total deaths between 1941 and 1945. By the way, I didn't say this at the outset. I should have at the beginning of the lecture. Historians have to estimate, but estimated losses in World War II worldwide is approximately 70 million. It used to be a little bit lower than that as the kind of consensus estimate, but it's now, I think, around 70 million. I think that actually makes more sense than some of the lower figures given earlier. So the Soviets invaded the Germans, the Wehrmacht invaded on three fronts, catching the Soviet Red Army on its heels. Stalin, for some reason, bizarre reason, didn't think Hitler was going to attack him and ignored warnings from his own intelligence chiefs and even, I think, more accurate warnings from British intelligence that said the Germans have already taken Poland. All they need is kind of an occupation force, rather small, but they're building up huge forces there, and the only reason they would be doing that is because they're planning to attack you. and yet Stalin refused to believe it and was actually angry when people suggested that was possible. It might have been because he thought Hitler would be crazy to invade a country the size of the Soviet Union, and Hitler would be crazy to invade me, the great Stalin. So it may have been his own ego and confidence, overconfidence, but it did leave the Soviets unprepared. Also leaving unprepared was the fact that there were communist officials with every Red Army unit, and in training, like basically boot camp, the Soviet soldier. This is talked about extensively and quite well in a book called Ivan's War, about the Red Army soldiers' experience in the war. But they spent more time studying communist doctrine and communist dogma propaganda than they did practicing discharging their weapons, etc., etc. So another reason that they were unprepared for this invasion. But in the early first couple of months, as you can see from the map, the Germans drove hundreds of miles inland on all three fronts: north, central, and southern. So by the winter of 1941, first year, with the freezing cold weather setting in, the famous cold of Russia, the estimated casualties were gigantic, about 174,000 killed, 400,000 wounded for Germany, and about 650,000 killed and 1.2 million wounded for the Red Army, with actually hundreds of thousands of Soviet Red Army troops captured. Blitzkrieg had time and time again sent pincers of panzer units and supporting infantry around entire Soviet corps and armies and captured 100,000, 200,000 at a time, and then like a week later would sort of move further east and do the same thing around another huge body of troops. So the Germans were capturing even more troops than they were killing and wounding. By the end of 1941, one German general said, "We are fighting an enemy that is superior to us in every way." That was just at the end of the first few months. They came close to capturing Moscow. Operation Typhoon in December of 1941 was a massive effort. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Those casualty figures right there are just for Operation Typhoon, which was mainly in 1 month. So that's not the first few months, that's just 1 month. Typhoon was an operation designed to take Moscow, but it failed, although they came close to Moscow. Some of the advanced units could see the spires on churches of the outskirts of Moscow. Hitler made another possibly fateful decision by siphoning off an entire army group from the central front where Moscow was right around this time and sent them to the southern front in the Ukraine, much to many of his generals' chagrin. Some of them begged him, tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't. Though there were generals that agreed with the strategy as well. Hitler and some of the top brass in the German on the German general staff believed that defeating the Soviet Union wasn't about taking their cities, even their capital. It was about just annihilating the Soviet Red Army wherever they found them. Nonetheless, historians once again, because it happened so many times in the war, criticized Hitler for how he prosecuted the war, and oftentimes, as we see once again, overruled his generals. So bad decisions from the top, from Hitler, right? He had many gifted generals and field marshals, the rank above general in the German military, and too much sycophancy from below, which is somewhat understandable that people would be afraid to counter Hitler's, express orders or even argue with him about strategy. But some did, and usually at least got away with doing it, even if he disagreed with them. So Andrew Roberts, British historian, again wrote a recent book that I referred to before called The Storm of War, said if different counsels had prevailed, the Reich would have been in a better position to prosecute the war, but Hitler could not have left soldiering to the soldiers. A Führer had to be a Superman, equal to any calling, and with such a spectacular know-it-all as Hitler, with views on everything, a love of military history, and an impressive recall of military facts, the prospect of taking a back seat in a world war was an emotional and psychological impossibility. Basically saying it was just not in his character makeup to sit back and let his generals do the job as experts. He was compelled to butt in by his own psychological issues. He goes on to say, in considering many of the errors made by Hitler, it's important to remember that there were usually generals, not just Keitel and Jodl, who were the generals around him all the time, who were basically yes men for him, who fully supported him and provided telling arguments for him. When dealing with Hitler, the generals, for all their iron crosses, were generally as cowardly as so many others in Nazi Germany. That, of course, speaks to the sycophancy. In the second year of the war on the Western Front, after things bogged down for the Germans in the snow, freezing cold, didn't take Moscow. And by the way, the German Wehrmacht, amazingly, wasn't prepared really for war in the wintertime. They didn't have much winter gear with them. This is because Blitzkrieg, as we know, was designed to get things over quickly. And the Germans actually were so overconfident, they thought the war would basically be over by the time winter came, which is astonishing to think about now. A country as big, both in population and geography as the Soviet Union, you're going to take that in 3 months, 4 months? Not likely. But by the spring of the second year, 1942, the Germans started to make impressive advances again, this time focusing their effort on the southern front. The northern front was already degenerating into vicious siege warfare with the German siege of Leningrad in the north. Central front was kind of holding. But the goal here was to send a number of armies through the south and further to the east into what was called the Caucasus. The Caucasus are basically where the stands are today. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the reason that that was of importance is because there were oil fields there. And remember that Germany's Achilles heel in this war was oil, so there was a mad dash to try to capture the oil fields. As part of this plan, the German 6th Army was supposed to kind of protect the main forces further to the south by kind of blocking any Red Army troops that tried to get from the north to the south. So they were kind of in an obstacle deliberately put in the way of the Soviets cutting off those units making the dash for the Caucasus. But as things worked out, the 6th Army, which was supposed to be a sideshow, ended up being the main show because and they were, of course, stationed at Stalingrad, which is now famous because of this battle, the battle here. And many scholars have thought this was the turning point, not just of the war on the Eastern Front, but some have thought it was the turning point of the war all the way around worldwide. And both sides end up throwing in everything, or as much as they could, to this battle. The 6th Army, an entire German army, almost took the city of Stalingrad, but the Russians tenaciously held on to the eastern end with their backs up against the Volga River and eventually kind of counterattacked and had several Soviet armies surround them, both in the city and out in the snow around it, eventually causing Field Marshal von Paulus, the commander of the army, to surrender against Hitler's orders. And this very well may have been the turning point of the war. Most of the 100,000 or so troops that surrendered, the remainder of what had once been a mighty army, didn't make it home in the end anyway. Go figure, the Soviets didn't treat attackers very well that had more or less wrecked their country. That, plus the fact that it was well known by this time that Soviet Red Army prisoners were treated horribly by the Germans. So German soldiers were, of course, very likely to be treated in similar fashion. I may have mentioned this in the class before, but 3 million Soviet Red Army prisoners died in captivity in prison camps, or really more concentration camps. Sometimes they were literally sent to concentration camps.